Now, they were scattered among the nations of the world for almost 1900 years. And then in 1882-ish, something happened. It was so quiet, people were not even aware of it. It was like a slow dripping of the faucet. Persecution in the Soviet Union at first, but a lot of Jews began to go back to Israel, 1882 and following. Aliyah, to ascend, to go up, and in different waves of emigration, they would begin to go back. There was always a continuous presence of Jews in the land of Israel, small. And when the Jews began to return, I told you yesterday, it was mostly malaria-infested swamp. Trees had been cut down by armies. When the locomotive was introduced into Israel, they would cut down the trees to fuel the locomotive, the Oriental Express. Syria, Turkey, who controlled Israel or that part of the world from 1517 to 1917, would tax landowners not by how many acres they had, but how many trees. So everybody cut down the trees to have lower taxes. When you had all the trees cut down, wouldn't hold the topsoil, the water would run down in the low areas and you had malaria-infested swamp. And as the Jews began to return, it was a sickly land. Few people living there. Absentee landlords. Some owned by Syrians. Some owned by Egyptians. And as the Jews would come back, they began to buy land. And those that they purchased it from laughed all the way to the bank because these silly Jews had bought malaria-infested swamp. And they began to drain it. Many of them died. If you go to Israel, you know what you'll see? Eucalyptus trees all over the place, particularly in the north. You know why eucalyptus trees? They imported them from Australia because they suck up tremendous amounts of water to drain the swamps. And slowly they began to make the land that had been barren and desolate and denuded and raped, they began to make it livable. And men began to see slowly the value of that land as they began to produce the citrus and other products. And now it became more attractive. King Hussein's grandfather, when he saw the Jews coming back, he said, "We welcome our Jewish brethren back. With Jewish technology and with the wealth of the Middle East, we can make it the paradise of the world," he said. And because he wanted to welcome them back, he was assassinated on the Temple Mount. King Hussein was right next to him. Just missed being assassinated himself. Every Arab leader who has tried to make a peace with Israel has been assassinated. Okay, from 1517 to 1917, 400 years. What you would call Israel today, and also Jordan and part of Lebanon, Syria, that was all controlled by Turkey, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which captured in 1517. Nobody settled there of significance. It was largely barren, desolate. It was controlled by absentee landlords. When armies would march through the land of Israel, you know what they would do? And they kept marching through it. Israel is the land bridge between three continents. We remember that when you hear about Israel in the news media today, Israel is the land bridge between three continents. Africa and Asia and Africa and Europe. Israel is the land. That's why more wars have been fought in that little peninsula than anywhere else in the world. It's the land bridge between three continents. You want to go from Africa to Asia or Africa to Europe, you normally would march through Israel. Between crazy tax laws, the land of Israel was largely raped. And when the rains came and there were no trees, the topsoil was washed off of the hills and the small mountains. And the result was, particularly in the northern part of Israel, malaria-infested swamp. Only a handful of Arabs lived there. There was no Palestinian state. There was no Jordan. Jordan doesn't get started until in connection with the First World War. A handful of Arabs and Jews. Always a continuing presence of Jews from the first century to the present day. Always. There was a historian said you could have gone 50 miles. Mark Twain visited Israel. Mark Twain wrote about Israel. He said you could go 50 miles without seeing a living soul. And then you'd come across a little sickly village. That's what it was like. As the Jews began to come back in the 1880s and following. And they purchased a lot of the land from absentee landlords and began to drain the swamps, and many of them died from malaria. The Jews began to return, and there had been Jew and Arab living together for centuries in Israel and living pretty good in certain areas. Then something happened in 1897. I want to give you some dates to remember. All of this will give you a frame of reference for what's happening now. In 1897, there was a man by the name of Theodor Herzl. You remember Theodor Herzl because he's the modern father of Israel. And Theodor Herzl was a playwright, very famous playwright in Europe. He was a Jew. He was a newspaper reporter, Switzerland, very well known. He was sent to France because a man by the name of Alfred Dreyfus was on trial, a Jewish captain in the French artillery, for selling secrets to the enemy. He was court-martialed, I think, 3 times, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison. Eventually he'd be exonerated, he'd be freed. Evidence would indicate it was a French general staff plot because of political reasons. And this French Jew was blamed. He was the scapegoat. But when Theodor Herzl saw what happened to this man and heard the slangs and the comments on the streets of France when he was covering the story, he wrote a little brochure calling for the Jewish state, simply called the Jewish state, 1897. As a result of that brochure, which was translated into many languages, he called the first Zionist Congress in 1897, Basel, Switzerland. After the first meeting, Theodor Herzl, incidentally, you know who supported Theodor Herzl? Can I tell you? A book should be written one day. Theodor Herzl was not supported by most of the Jewish leaders of his day. Most Jewish leaders, for instance in Germany, were against him. They said, look, we're doing pretty good in Germany right now. How interesting. American Jews said, we're doing pretty good in America right now. We've got more freedom than we've ever had before. Don't rock the boat. Don't cause problems. Don't cause more anti-Semitism. Keep quiet about a Jewish state. Do you know who supported him? Bible-believing evangelical Christian leaders. Moody Bible Institute went on record. I've seen documentation. And other great evangelical leaders of supporting his call for a homeland for the Jew. Do you know who opened the doors for an audience with the aristocracy of Europe? A godly Christian chaplain for one of the kings of Europe. I visited his personal library, Theodor Herzl, Bible, given to him by a Christian friend. In the flyleaf, he pleads with him to read Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and other messianic prophecies that pointed to Christ. If the history were known, it was Bible believers more than anybody else who supported Theodor Herzl in the call for a homeland for the Jew because of their understanding of the Word of God. Nobody's told the story. All kinds. Wingate, who trained the Israeli army, was a British general, Bible believer. Carried a rifle in one hand and the Bible in the other. And he taught the Israelis how to fight and survive. Ode Wingate, a hero in Israel to this day. Other Christian leaders who came to the aid through the whole period, which I'm now addressing. Not the Jewish leaders. Jewish leaders hassled Theodor Herzl. But there was enough interest, and he called a Zionist Congress in 1897. After the first meeting, he went up to his room, and in his diary, it's there to this day, in his diary, he made a fascinating statement. Listen to what he said. Today, and he was like a prophet. If you saw a picture of Theodor Herzl, flaming eyes, a man of deep-seated... When everybody was against him, this guy kept going. Remind me of the Apostle Paul. He just kept going, looked for an opening door somewhere. Everybody was opposing him. He kept going. He said, today I have founded the modern state of Israel. Listen to what he wrote. It will become a reality in 5 or 50 years. What a funny statement. It will become a reality in 5 or 50 years. He wrote that in 1897. 1947, 50 years to the year, the United Nations would partition Palestine and form a Jewish state. Intriguing. Anyhow, he said that in 1897. Today I founded the modern state of Israel. There would be more Zionist congresses calling for a homeland for the Jew. And there was debate as to where that homeland should be. Some said it can't be in Israel. They had South America. They had places in Africa. In the end, they said the only place we could have a homeland for the Jew is Israel. That's where our roots are. Intriguing, all that occurred. That was 1897. There was movement, but nothing happened. Then the First World War broke out. And during the First World War, the Jews in Israel fought with the Allies. At the end of the First World War, Great Britain captured that area of the world that we call Palestine. It included Syria, some of Lebanon, and not Syria. It included Jordan, what we call Jordan today, some of Lebanon, a little bit of Syria. That was captured from the Ottoman Turkish Empire during the First World War. Remember, the Ottoman Turks controlled it from 1517 to 1917, 400 years, and the British captured it in the First World War. Now, one of the things the British did was they established the modern state of Jordan. Why? Remember Lawrence of Arabia? Put some of the facts together. Lawrence of Arabia was a British officer, and he got many of the Arabs in that part of the world to fight with the British during the First World War. So as payment for that support and loyalty, they gave some of the sheiks some of the ground that was historically Palestine and formed the modern state of Jordan. That's when it happened, First World War. Now, in 1917, following the First World War, Great Britain came out with a document that has been the basis in the United Nations for the discussions of the Middle East and Israel. And that document is called the Balfour Declaration, named after Lord Balfour of Great Britain. For Balfour said, His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a homeland in Palestine for the Jew. That was a momentous statement by the British Empire. It came out of the fact that Chaim Weizmann, who would become the first president of Israel, was a British citizen, was a brilliant chemist. And during the First World War, the Allies were in danger because they were running out of explosives. And they went to this brilliant Jewish chemist and they said, "Can you help us, the War Department of Great Britain?" And he rolled up his sleeves almost without even going to sleep for weeks and discovered a cordite, a synthetic that could use to control explosives. It may have changed the outcome of the First World War. They were indebted to this man. And they said, "What can we do for you?" He said, "Nothing for me, but for my people a homeland." There were godly believers in Great Britain in places of prominence at that time, all sympathetic to the Jewish cause. Out of that, all kinds of political intrigue. In 1917, Great Britain said, His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a homeland in Palestine for the Jew. That was in 1917. That's the basis for so much of the discussion today. Remember that Great Britain controlled it. Who'd they get it from? From Turkey. Turkey had captured it in war 400 years earlier. You ought not to think there were established nations there. There were none. There was no government in what is called Israel today. There was no citizenship. There was no passports. That's recent innovations for political reasons, propagated to the public of the West. That was 1917. In 1922, if you remember that the League of Nations was formed, League of Nations, 1922. World body. The League of Nations gave to Great Britain what is called the mandate. That is, the League of Nations said, "We want you to establish a homeland in Palestine for the Jew." That was 1922. Okay? 3 dates I've given you, very important to understand what's happening. 1897, First Zionist Congress, call for a homeland for the Jew. After 1900 years being out of the land, unprecedented in the annals of history. But God said, "I'll drive you out and I'll bring you back." They'd go down to Egypt, they'd come back. They'd go into Babylon, they'd come back. They'd go all over the world, they'll get back. And so in 1922, Great Britain said, we want you to establish that homeland. A mandate from a worldwide body as early as 1922. Remember that because the League of Nations was the forerunner of the United Nations. But there were political realities, governments changed, there were still some Jews who didn't want it. They thought you were going to cause another wave of anti-Semitism, and it didn't happen. It moves you all the way up to 1938. And now you're about to have a Second World War. And many Jews are now beginning to flee from Adolf Hitler, as Hitler has already started his purge of the Jews in Europe earlier than that. And as Hitler is beginning his rise to power, Jews begin to leave Germany and Europe. Now I'm going to give you facts you may not like. Many of them wanted to come into America, and America said, sorry, you can't come. They wanted to come into Canada, and Canada said, sorry, you can't come. They wanted to go into Australia, and they said, sorry, the Western nations of the world. Now, the reason is back in those days they had immigration quotas, and they said, you reach that quota, no more from that geographical location. But here were Jews who were fleeing Adolf Hitler, right into the Second World War. Had they been allowed to come into the Western nations, hundreds of thousands would have lived. Instead, they were trapped. In fact. But one of the places that a lot of them tried to go was to Israel, if they could get to Israel. Survival, maybe. And so more and more Jews began in the 30s to go back to Israel. As a result of it, who was controlling Palestine at that time? Great Britain. Captured it in 1917, still had it. The surrounding Arab nations went to Great Britain and said, we do not like these Jews coming back here. Under pressure from the Arab nations in 1938, with the handwriting on the wall, another war is imminent, and wanting the surrounding Arabs to fight with the British during the Second World War as they had in the First World War. Under that pressure, Great Britain passed what is called the White Papers, 1938. The White Papers restricted Jewish emigration into Palestine, or Israel, to 15,000 people a year. Now, I want you to get the frame of reference, the context. Jews were now literally fleeing for their lives. Were not allowed to go to most of the Western nations. Immigration quotas had already been filled. They were fleeing for their lives. They'd go from one country in Europe to another if they could make it, and the Nazis were right behind. So they were trying to get into Israel any way they could. And at that point in time, only 1,500. 15,000 a year. 1,500 about a month. Who was the former Prime Minister of Israel? Menachem Begin. Do you know what the press said when Menachem Begin came to power? They said Israel has a terrorist. That's what the press said. Show you the quotes. Terrorist. You know why he was a terrorist? Can I give you the historical facts? Because when Jews were trying to flee Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and couldn't get into most of the nations of the world, they were trying to flee into Israel, trying to get into Israel any way they could. And the British were enforcing the White Papers, only 1,500 a month. Menachem Begin was trying to bring these Jews in to save their lives. In the doing of that, he was opposing the British. Had to fight them. And it escalated. And so he was called a terrorist. But see the historical context. Now, that was in 1938. The Second World War broke out. The Jews in Israel fought with the Allies against the Nazis during the Second World War. The end of the war, 1945. Approximately 6 million Jews perished in the death camps of Europe. Forgive me, I'm astounded. I thought I'd seen enough of life that I don't get surprised easy, but I'm astounded at the literature that has been propagated by so-called Christian organizations that is still pushing that there were not 6 million Jews that were killed. It was a couple of 100,000, and that's still part of a Jewish plot to take over the world. I wish you could visit the the death camps that I visited in Europe, I think, what were they going to do in Europe? What were they going to do in Germany and in Poland, where all of them lost most of their families? Where often, listen, I'm going to give you the hard facts, they were turned into the Gestapo by their neighbors for a bottle of vodka. Frequently. There were notable exceptions. There were heroic souls. But their homes were destroyed. They were occupied. The memories were terrible. They survived the death camps. What were they going to do? Go back home? So a lot of them tried to go to Israel following the Second World War. But the white papers were still in effect, only 15,000 a year. So here were Jews trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea from Europe any way they can, on dilapidated, unseaworthy fishing boats, anything they could get on. You still had, I know you don't like to hear this, you still had the British Navy. I'm not picking on Great Britain, I love it. You still had the British Navy, destroyers, planes, radar, and they would watch for these ships as they'd come across the Mediterranean. And when they'd get within the 3 mile or the 12 miles of the shore of Israel, they would stop these ships. And they would send them back to the port of embarkation where they left Europe. Or else they would intern them on the island of Cyprus, in the Mediterranean. And they literally put them into compounds, not much improved from the concentration camps they'd been in. I shouldn't say that, they were better, but they were still in compounds. And they would allow 1,500 a month from Cyprus to come to Israel. Except there was one ship called the Exodus. Large group of Jews were on the Exodus, trapped by the British Navy. They said, you can't come in. They said, we're not going back. They said, we're going to board you. They said, if you board us, we're going to blow the ship up with every man, woman, and child aboard. And now the world was focused on that ship and that event. The British Navy said, well, we're just going to stay here until you turn and go back. And they said, well, we're not going to eat. And as our people begin to die of starvation, many of them were already half dead, we're going to throw the bodies over the side for the world to see. At that moment, Great Britain had more than 100,000 troops stationed in Israel, trying to keep an uneasy peace between the Arabs and the Jew. Here they had the problem of the Exodus. They had been given a mandate in 1922 to establish that homeland for the Jew by the League of Nations. They had said, we want to establish the homeland for the Jew in 1917, but because of political reasons, change of governments, they reneged on those promises. And now they turned the matter over to the United Nations, which had been established after the Second World War in 1947. When they turned it over to the United Nations voted. Nobody knew how it would go. I'll tell you a little separate story. Wow. I'll tell you a little separate story. Harry Truman. I love Harry Truman. You may not like Harry Truman. I like Harry Truman, okay? I don't know how his daughter sang, but I like Harry Truman. I'll tell you one little story. You remember he had the little sign, the buck stops here. The State Department of America was lobbying against Israel. Our ambassador to the United Nations was lobbying against Israel. Our Pentagon was lobbying against Israel. The reason was, they said, if Israel becomes a nation, she is liable to be stillborn, and if we have supported her, it will be bad for our prestige. So our Defense Department, our Secretary of State, our ambassador to the United Nations in America was not supporting Israel. Only Harry Truman, the President of the United States, had a friend who was Jewish. Before Harry Truman got into politics, do you know what he was in America? Anybody know what he was? He was a haberdasher. Know what that is? He sold men's clothing. Had a men's clothing store. And he had a partner in his men's clothing. What kind of partner could he have but a Jewish guy? So he had a partner who was Jewish. So he had a Jewish friend. When all of this was going on, Harry Truman's friend from Missouri, I'm from Missouri, show me, flew to see the president, his friend, and pled with Harry Truman to give his people a chance. The president was non-committal. The next day, he picked up the phone. Talk about the little incidents in history, and that God has his hands on everything. The next day, Harry Truman, President of the United States, picked up the phone. This is when America was dominating the world, uncontestedly, 1947. He picked up the phone and he called the ambassador of America to the United Nations, and he said, "You will throw America's support behind the state of Israel." He did it against the advice of the Secretary of State, the head of the Pentagon, and all of those advisors in Washington. With the U.S.'s support at that time, others got on board. And when the vote was taken in 1947, the vote passed to partition Palestine and to form a Jewish state. Now, the area that was allocated for Israel was far smaller than what she had been promised for years by the British. Just a small area of that, very small, and not the best area. Israel said, "It's not what we've been promised, but we'll accept it." The surrounding Arab nations, I'm giving you facts, said if Israel declares herself a nation, we will drive her into the Mediterranean Sea within 1 week. On May 14th, 1948, Israel declared herself a nation, not from Jerusalem because she was not given Jerusalem. That was part of what you hear about today as the West Bank. In Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion, first prime minister, stood up and declared Israel a nation among the nations of the world. The advice of friends to the Jewish state, American generals, friends from all over the world, was don't do it. You cannot survive an attack from the surrounding Arab nations. You're a small little people, 620,000. There's no way you could survive that attack. Don't do it. Ben-Gurion would later write, he was a great student, incidentally, of the prophetic word. Did you know that? Great student of the prophetic word, as is Menachem Begin, who has a Bible study in his home every week, Old Testament, with Jewish leaders and rabbis. And Ben-Gurion said, I knew it was our moment in history. And if I passed it by, it might never happen again. And so he stood up May 14th, 1948, and called Israel a nation among the nations of the world. Now, the surrounding Arab nations said to the Palestinian Arabs living in Israel, and you'll understand they were citizens, any Arab that had land that was living in the area that was allocated for a Jewish state was allowed to stay there. He was allowed to be a citizen, first-class citizen. He kept his land. He had his representative in the Congress or the Knesset. He was a citizen of Israel, no problem. There are more than 1 million non-Jews who are citizens of Israel right now, just so we have proper perspective. They were there, and they spoke Hebrew in large measure, and the Jews who were there spoke Arabic. They'd been neighbors, many of them, for centuries. The surrounding Arab nations said, we're going to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean in 1 week. So you get out of the way, and after we destroy them, you could go back, and you can have your property, and you can have your neighbor's property too. The Jews did not drive them out, they did not threaten them, they did not intimidate them. As a matter of fact, there's overwhelming evidence that they pled with them to stay. Of their own volition, Arab Palestinians left the area of Israel and went into what we know today as the West Bank. That was part of the area that was allocated for a Palestinian state. A strip of land approximately 100 miles long, 20 miles wide, starting about 15 miles south of the Sea of Galilee and going down to about the middle of the Dead Sea. It's called the West Bank because it is on the western side of the Jordan River. So they call it the West Bank. Biblically, it was Judea, Samaria.
that was the West Bank. So the Arabs in the Jewish area, many of them, not all of them, left and went into the West Bank and thought, we'll wait here a week. The Arab nations will come through and drive the Jews into the Mediterranean, then we can go back and have our land and theirs. Problem was, it didn't happen that way. So that when you reached the ceasefire in 1949, not only had Israel survived, but she had actually captured some of the Arab territory by the time they reached the ceasefire. But now you had these Arabs who had lived inside of Israel, who on their own volition had left and settled on the West Bank. Now you would say, well, the 80 million plus Arabs and the Arab nations could easily absorb this, maybe 600,000. But they chose not to. They chose not to absorb them, not to allow them in, not to give them any aid deliberately. Rather, they kept them there, designedly so, to show the world what these Zionist imperialists, these Jews, have done to their poor people, destroyed a nation. For 19 years, they were fed and clothed by the United Nations, about 90% of which was paid for by the United States. And the Arab nations didn't give one dime. Deliberately kept them there to be able to say, look at what the Jews have done to these poor Palestinians, who left of their own choice because the Arab nation said, get out, we're going to destroy the Jews. That's what happened in 48. That's the War of Independence.
The next day, 6 Arab nations attacked. Israel had no army to speak of, had no modern equipment at all. Do you know what they had for a plane? For a plane, they had one Piper Cub. Two-seated Piper Cub. You know what they did? They made homemade bombs, Molotov cocktails. Would open the cockpit of the plane and throw the bombs out the window. An Egyptian armada came up the coastline, was shelling Tel Aviv, and they had no artillery to reach those ships. They had no planes to attack those ships. One Piper Cub. They made a number of passes over that armada of Egyptian ships, and one of those hand-thrown Molotov cocktails hit one of the ships, and the entire armada turned around and went back. I could tell you how 2 youngsters, a 15 and a 16-year-old, right off the shores of the Sea of Galilee, at a kibbutz, Degania, right at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, as the Iraqis were coming across to cut Israel in half, they invaded this kibbutz, farmers. They had barbed wire, and the tanks went right through the barbed wire. They had nothing to knock out these tanks. They were going to retreat, and some of the older men pled for the men to fight on. 2 kids, 2 youngsters, hiding in the bush, climbed up onto 2 of the tanks. With homemade Molotov cocktails, they were able to knock out 2 of the tanks. The entire attacking force withdrew across the Jordan Valley. I could recite to you, you can call it what you want, miracle after miracle after miracle in 1948. There was a brief ceasefire, and Golda Meir, who Ben Gurion used to call the best man in my cabinet. Golda Meir, you know, she was born in Russia, was brought to the United States as a young girl. She was educated in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She went to college in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She taught public school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And then as a young woman, she became a Zionist and went back to Israel and moved up in the hierarchy of Israel. Brilliant woman. You know, when she was Prime Minister of Israel, all the generals would come to her house, and she literally would be cooking the soup and the food for the generals in her little home while she was Prime Minister. Very intriguing kind of a thing. At any rate, they sent her to America and Canada to try to raise some money, maybe $15 million, because they had sent agents out who had located some pre-First World War equipment that they could buy to help defend themselves, but they didn't have the money. And so Golda Meir got on a plane, flew into New York City, and then she spoke in rallies in Canada and the U.S. that had been quickly arranged, and she raised over $60 million, I think, in about a week. Word went out all over Israel, all over the world, to Israeli agents to buy whatever they could get, and equipment began to come in during a brief ceasefire that had been arranged by the United Nations. And Israel got this equipment in during that brief ceasefire. Among it were jeeps, 4-wheel jeeps, with automatic weapons that they could mount on the jeeps. And Moshe Dayan, who had been the Israeli chief of staff, who had the patch over the eye, who died a few years ago, you all are familiar, I think, with Moshe Dayan. He had fought as an officer in the British military during the Second World War, highly trained. He mounted automatic weapons on these four-wheel jeeps and went into the Sinai and just blew away the Egyptian advance. The whole tide of the battle changed, and they reached a ceasefire in 1949. When the ceasefire was reached, Israel had not only held on to what had been allocated to her in the United Nations resolution, but actually captured a little bit more territory. Time will not permit. Perhaps we'll touch on it tomorrow. But in 1956, Israel would go to war again. First one was 48, now 56. Because Nasser of Egypt would try to close off the Suez Canal, 1956, to strangle Israel economically. And a number of European nations and Israel raced to the Suez Canal and broke that blockade. That was in 56. In 67, you don't know it, but the world was on the verge of nuclear war. And in 1967, excuse me, that was 1973, 1967, Israel knew that she was about to be attacked by at least 4 Arab nations. Israel had a policy and has a policy of what is called preemptive strike. Preemptive strike means whenever we know that we're going to be attacked, we must hit first. It's policy. You can expect it every time. If you come across our borders and you hit our people, we must go back across and hit twice as many. If we know that we're going to be attacked, our land is too small, our bridges are too fragile, we cannot absorb a first strike attack against us, we must have tremendous intelligence, the Mossad, and we must know when an attack is coming, and we must hit first. In 1967, June of 1967, they knew they were about to be attacked by Syria and Egypt and some other supportive Arab nations. Israel sent her ships, her planes, one by one, out into the Mediterranean Sea, west, away from the Arab nations. Just inconspicuously, a plane would take off from an airfield. Another would take off in the north. 20 minutes later, another would take off. They went out into the Mediterranean, west. A whole armada of planes, or a whole wing of planes, met in the Mediterranean with a carefully executed plan. Way out off of the screens of radar in Egypt and Syria, which were being manned by Russian technicians. Israel shot down Russian pilots in dogfights that you didn't hear about in the news. Russian technicians were manning at that time radar in Egypt and Syria. Israel went off the radar screens out in the Mediterranean and then inconspicuously dipped down under the radar, 20 feet above the water, and took the journey in below the radar, fanned out to pre-designed targets, and devastated the Arab Air Force, 6 countries, in a matter of a couple of hours, caught all their planes on the ground, and defeated the Arab world's Air Force in a matter of a couple of hours. The 6-day war was over in a couple of hours. It lingered on for one of the most amazing wars in all of human history. That was 1967. 1973. Israel was told by her Mossad that an attack was coming, and she refused to believe it. So puffed up with pride, they thought they were invincible. And on a cold day in October, Israel was attacked. Though they had been warned, though they'd been told it was coming, they were told the day it was coming, Yom Kippur, their highest holy day, only skeleton crews in the Sinai, only skeleton crews on the Golan Heights, and they were caught asleep. And they were almost defeated in the first couple of hours. Only by the grace of God, Egypt came across the Suez Canal with, listen, 2,200 tanks committed. 2,200. Syria was coming across the Golan Heights with as much as 1,800 tanks. Some of the biggest tank battles would follow in human history, even bigger than the Second World War. Israel was caught off guard as these tanks just started to roll. And they made great advances, so much so that they began to worry that it was an Israeli attack. After you're beaten and beaten and beaten and beaten, and now you have success, you begin to worry. More importantly, they were following Russian tactic, Russian leadership. And the whole plan was you go so far and then you stop. You bring up your your spare equipment, you reinforce, you bring up your ground-to-air missiles to keep an umbrella over your advance, then you move again. Had they continued going, it would have been all over. For Israel has a very small standing army, and they were caught unprepared. But they can mobilize the army in 24 hours. Everybody in Israel is in the army from age 18 to 55. You're in the army. Active reserves after you've served 3 years, but till you're 55. And so you could be at the beach in Tel Aviv, and all of a sudden 4 planes come by and they make a certain maneuver, which means nothing to anybody else but a battalion of soldiers. When they see that maneuver, they had to report to duty. Or you're listening to the radio and it says, Charlie Fox at 7:30. Doesn't mean anything to me, but to a battalion of Israeli soldiers, it meant get to your duty station immediately. They have a way of mobilizing the nation in 24 hours. And because the Syrians and the Egyptians had such success and under Russian tactics stopped to reinforce, it gave Israel an opportunity to mobilize their troops. But they were almost on the verge of defeat during the first few days. And Moshe Dayan, chief of staff at that time, went to Golda Meir, who was prime minister at that time. I'm going to quote. He said, the third temple is about to fall. What he was saying is, we're in danger of being defeated. And he requested permission to arm their nuclear devices. And they have them, be sure of it. They came out of storage silos. They went to a number of different airfields, and they were armed and loaded and readied, if absolutely necessary. The Soviet Union saw what Israel was doing and rushed atomic devices to Syria by ship. America's spy satellites saw what Russia was doing, and Russia, incidentally, was loading paratroopers onto planes to be brought into Libya. I'm giving you facts. That's when former President Nixon called a red alert of the American military, and our men in the States were locked into their storage silos of the anti-ballistic missiles. Red alert. And just at that time, Israel launched a counterattack over the Golan Heights and across the Suez Canal and surrounded the Egyptian Third Army, and dramatically and miraculously changed the tide of battle. And Israel's atomic bombs went back into storage silos. Russia recalled its nuclear devices. The U.S. troops went out from under red alert. And immediately, when the tide of battle changed, the United Nations called for a ceasefire. While Israel was losing, the nations of the world didn't say zilch, just some Western nations. When the tide of battle began to change, and Israel was now on the way to Damascus and to Cairo, very quickly the United Nations had a ceasefire within 24 hours. And America put pressure on Israel not to go any further, lest the Soviet Union have to get involved. That was in 1973.
In the north, from the Sea of Galilee all the way north to Mount Hermon in modern-day Lebanon, they captured a mountain range called the Golan Heights, which was part of biblical Israel. The Golan Heights, a mountain range. Up there was one of the cities of refuge in Old Testament days. Now, from 1948 to 1967, the Syrians, with Russian advisors, planted miles of barbed wire and behind it minefields. More miles of barbed wire and behind it minefields, and a third strand of barbed wire. It was a Russian tactic. 3 strands. Barbed wire, minefields, barbed wire, minefields, barbed wire. And interspersed all along more than 3 million mines along this mountain range. And interspersed were pillboxes. I stood in them. If you go to Israel, a good tour, you'll get there along the Golan Heights. Pillboxes, more than 3 feet reinforced concrete, with 3 to 4 feet of packed down dirt on top, stronger, better reinforced than any of the pillboxes during the Second World War. And up along this Golan Heights mountain range from 1948 to 67, below the mountain range was the Israeli farm communities, the kibbutz. And for 19 years, the Syrians would shell these Israeli farm communities. For 19 years, they'd shell them. The children lived underground, in underground shelters. They went to school underground. They ate underground. Sometimes the children did not see the light of day for months at a time. And then they'd bring them out occasionally at night when there was a lull in the shelling to get some fresh air. For 19 years. But in 1967, Israel captured that Golan Heights mountain range. How'd they do it? They had a man by the name of Eli Cohen. If you go to Israel, you'll see Eli Cohen boulevards all over the place. Eli Cohen was a Jew born in Egypt, raised in Egypt. His mother tongue was Egyptian. His culture was Egyptian, Arabic. But he was a Jew who was now living in Israel. They trained him at the Israeli Mossad to be an agent. With falsified papers, they sent him to Argentina, Buenos Aires, because there were a lot of Syrian businessmen living in Buenos Aires. He went there with all kind of false papers, though he was an Egyptian Arab. He began to meet all of the Syrians living there. He fronted as the exporter of fine furniture, got to know all of these men. After he was there for a year or two, with falsified papers, he now moved to Syria. Now many of the businessmen he had met in Argentina were now back in Syria, and they knew him and quickly became friendly. He continued to front as the exporter of fine furniture and was making money like you wouldn't believe while an Israeli agent exporting fine furniture. And he had this lovely, magnificent home, beautifully furnished, and he'd throw these magnificent parties with beautiful women, and he would invite all of the generals of the Syrian general staff and high political personalities. And he met the president of Syria's daughter, who fell madly in love with him. This is an Israeli agent. He would throw these parties at night, and by the time the party was over, all of the discussions that had gone on in the Syrian general staff meetings in the morning, he knew about at night. He had one of the most powerful radio transmitters built to that time. And after the party broke up, he would take out this carefully concealed radio transmitter, and he would call back to Israel, and he would tell them everything that took place in the Syrian staff meeting that morning. This guy became very friendly with the chief of staff of the Syrian army. And he said, I'd like to visit the Golan Heights. And so the chief of staff was his very close personal friend. He went to the Golan Heights for weeks. And in front of the generals, he would take out his drawing pads as he traveled along the Golan Heights. And he would sketch in where the minefields were, where the barbed wire was, where the pillboxes were, where the tanks were, where the artillery was. He'd just sketch it in all over the place, in front of them, as he would discuss with them, why are you doing it, and so forth. Then one day he said to his friend, he said, the Israelis are not dummies. He said, before they attack, they'll send over observation planes. And they'll see where you've got your pillboxes and your tanks and your troops. And he said, you want to conceal that. Beside that, it gets so hot up here. Your men are in the sunshine. There's no shade for them. Do one thing that'll help you two ways. Plant this particular kind of a tree that grows rapidly and gives a lot of shade. It'll conceal your positions from the air, makes sense, and it'll also give shade to your troops who won't be as hot. Good idea. And so they planted these trees. And Eli Cohen simply wired Israel. He says, every time you see one of these trees, there's a Syrian pillbox next to it, shell the tree. Happened. Then he took these drawings that he had made. He hollowed out the leg of a table, put the drawings inside, sent the table and the chairs to Argentina, wound up in the hands of an Israeli agent. When Israel attacked the Golan Heights in 1967, they knew where everything was because of Eli Cohen. About 3 months later, after the victory, Eli Cohen, still in Syria with a wife and kids in Tel Aviv, was routinely calling home, calling Israel. And the Indian government, the Indian embassy, had been getting interference when she was trying to call India. And so they went to the authorities in Syria and said, something's wrong, we're getting all this interference. They thought something didn't sound right. They got electric technicians with equipment, and over a period of time they honed in on that signal from 3 locations, and they finally found out it was in the home of Eli Cohen. Israel said, we've got over 600 Syrian prisoners in our jails. We'll empty the prisons. 600 or so can go. Let us have Eli Cohen back. They said no. They hung him upside down in Damascus Square and left the body there for ridicule and all that was involved. And then Israel said, we'll give you $15 million in farm equipment for his body. And they said no, and they buried the body of Eli Cohen in an unmarked grave somewhere in Damascus, Syria. But he was the unsung hero of the 1967 Six-Day War, and you'll find boulevards all over Israel, Eli Cohen Boulevard. But that's how they captured the whole Golan Heights. Now, the world comes to Israel and says, give up the Golan Heights. And Israel says, you've got to be out of your tree. From 1948 to, listen, ladies and gentlemen, from 48 to 67, the Syrians were up there. And for 19 years on the mountaintop, all they did was shell the Israeli communities below. You know how Israel took that? They went to these kibbutz and got the soldiers out of those kibbutz. You know, in Israel, everybody's in the army. When you're 18, you're drafted. Men and women. Men and women. Men for 3 years, women for 2 years normally, but you stay in the active reserves till you're 55. Israel is a very small standing army, about 160,000, but they'll mobilize 450,000 in 48 hours. And they keep getting training. Now, they took the men out of the kibbutz right underneath where they were getting shelled. And they said, okay, this is where you live? Is it up there they were shelling you from? You go get them. You know, just like Nehemiah. He had them build it right where they lived. And they took the Israeli soldiers and said, okay, you go attack it. Incidentally, everything was built up there by Russian technicians. Russian technicians told them what to do. If you see some of the pillboxes, if you can visualize, here's the mountaintop and here are the Israelis. Some of the pillboxes, like a third of the way down the mountain, did not have their openings facing toward Israel. They had their openings facing toward the top of the mountain. Russian technicians. The Russians said the Israelis are too smart. They're not going to suicidally simply try to come up this mountain. They'll do two things. They'll try to come up the mountain, but they'll also drop paratroopers on the top to come down. They were right. It's exactly what Israel did. And some of the pillboxes were facing where they knew they would come from, up the top. All right, so in 1967, Israel captured the Golan Heights, this mountain range. Now the world says, give it up. They lost thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. It's a natural, defensible border, and the world says, give it up. And Israel says, you're out of your skull. Do you realize there's a law for the world and there's another law they want for Israel? Everybody else wins things in battles. Nobody says give it up. In a battle that they didn't want and didn't start. Okay, they won the Golan Heights. They also won Jerusalem and the West Bank. Concerning the West Bank, Israel has said and repeated, and I had cabinet level officials say to me in Israel, the Palestinians can live here, the West Bank. They can live there, they can have their own schools, they can have their own mayors, they can have their own police, they can run everything they want independently, but it's got to be in a Jewish state because we've got to have some outposts there. Because if we simply turn it over to the Palestinians, the PLO, the terrorists, will be there in 6 months right up against our border and put us in an impossible to defend position. So they can live there, they can have everything autonomously. The PLO says we don't want that. We don't even recognize the existence of Israel. And if any of the Palestinians said, we'll do it, the PLO would kill them. People don't realize, you don't get it in the press. Most of the Palestinians hate the PLO. If they would cooperate with Israel, their loved ones would get killed. The Christians at this moment, about 45% in general terms, Christendom, in Lebanon, welcome the Israelis as heroes. But you'll get very little of that in the press today. A young man by the name of Zvi Greengold. He was a lieutenant in the Israeli Tank Corps, the officer who was in charge of the supplying and the refueling. He was on furlough, on leave, when the war broke out in October of 1973. He was in civilian clothing. He heard the war had broken out. He hitchhiked, confiscated the vehicle, and got to the front lines. And he asked his commanding officer for a command. They gave him 4 tanks. He was in civilian clothing. You could be 5 miles away from the front lines in Israel. He got 4 tanks, and they started up the Golan Heights. this mountain range, and 2 of the tanks immediately got knocked out, destroyed. His tank backed off and 1 other tank. They went along the base of the Golan Heights, and he found a narrow ravine that was thought inaccessible. And he was able to get his tank up this inaccessible ravine, up onto the Golan Heights, and he would attack Syrian tanks, and then he would hide. It was all sand dune and mountainous. He would hit and run, or he'd hit at night and hide under the concealment of darkness. He would expend all of his fuel and all of his shells. He would come back down again. He would refuel and rearm and go back up again. He fought on for 48 hours, non-stop. At one point, his tank was destroyed. He was able to confiscate another passing by Israeli tank. He fought on. He was badly burned on the face and the hands. After 48 hours, he came down, fell before his commanding officer. He said, "I can do no more." And they document that he knocked out over 60 Syrian tanks. Miracles no less great than the miracles you read about in the Old Testament.